The invitation had said casual family gathering, so I wore the nice sundress I'd bought on clearance 2 years ago and brought a fruit salad I'd stayed up cutting the night before, because store-bought felt like admitting something I didn't want to admit. My brother Weston's backyard pool sat behind a house that had tripled in value since he married into money, and every summer gathering there felt like a small test I hadn't studied for. I want to be honest about how much thought went into that sundress because it embarrasses me a little now looking back. I'd tried on 3 different outfits before settling on it, standing in front of the mirror in my apartment, turning sideways, wondering whether it looked like I was trying too hard or not hard enough, whether either impression would matter to anyone but me. Weston's house had a certain gravity to it that made everyone around it perform slightly, myself included, no matter how much I told myself I didn't care what his wife's friends thought of my clothes. I cared. I hated that I cared, and I cared anyway. Weston and I grew up sharing a bedroom with a curtain instead of a door in a 2-bedroom rental our mother worked 2 jobs to keep us in. We'd been close once, the kind of close that comes from actually meeting each other, splitting the last of the cereal evenly, walking each other to the bus stop, covering for each other when one of us got in trouble. Somewhere along the way, after he met Priscilla in business school and married into her family's construction empire, that closeness had thinned out into something more like courteous distance, maintained mostly by our mother's insistence that we all still show up for holidays and birthdays, pretending the space between us wasn't widening every year. I'd built a life I was proud of, even if it didn't look like Weston's from the outside. I worked as a physical therapist at a community clinic, work that mattered to me in a way I didn't know how to explain to people who measured worth in square footage. I was raising Ivy alone since her father left when she was 3, and most months the math of daycare and rent and the clinic's modest salary worked out fine, if narrowly, if without much room for anything extra. I wasn't poor, not in any sense that would have registered to anyone actually struggling. But next to Weston's world, the country club memberships, the 2 cars in the driveway that cost more than my annual salary, the private school tuition Priscilla mentioned so casually it took me a year to realize how enormous the number actually was. I existed on a different financial plane entirely, and everyone in that family seemed to know exactly where the line was drawn, even when nobody said it out loud. My daughter Ivy, 7 years old, had been looking forward to this pool party for 2 weeks. She didn't understand any of the class calculus that hummed quietly beneath every family gathering. She loved her cousin Beckett, worshipped him the way younger kids worship slightly older ones, with an uncomplicated devotion that made my chest ache a little every time I watched it because I knew things about that family dynamic that Ivy, thankfully, still didn't. Beckett was 9, tall for his age, confident in the particular way kids get when every adult around them has spent years telling them how special they are. Ivy thought he hung the moon. She'd talk about him for days after any gathering. Beckett showed me his new bike. Beckett let me play his video game. Beckett said I could come to his birthday party, collecting these small moments of inclusion like treasures. She'd packed her own pool bag with a towel and goggles she'd chosen herself from the drugstore, a pair with a cartoon dolphin on the strap that she'd picked specifically because Beckett had once mentioned he liked dolphins. She'd hummed the whole car ride over, kicking her feet against the seat in that restless, joyful energy kids get before something they've been anticipating, telling me all the games she and Beckett would play, the handstand contests, the races across the shallow end. I remember glancing at her in the rearview mirror at a red light, her goggles already pushed up on her forehead though we were still 20 minutes from the house, and feeling grateful, in that ordinary parental way, that she had this. Cousins, family, a place she felt she belonged. I should have known something was different the moment we walked through the gate. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just a texture in the air, the kind of shift you register in your body before your mind catches up to naming it. The backyard was fuller than I'd expected for a casual family gathering. Not just us and Weston's immediate family, but a cluster of other kids I didn't recognize, along with a couple of parents I vaguely placed as people from Priscilla's social circle, the country club crowd, women in expensive cover-ups lounging on the same kind of chaise Priscilla had bought in bulk 2 summers ago. Beckett and his friends from the private school Weston and Priscilla had enrolled him in, a school with a name that Priscilla dropped into conversation the way other people mention the weather, were clustered by the diving board, cannonballing off it in turns, shrieking with the specific delight of kids who feel entirely at home in a space. Ivy ran toward them immediately, towel already dropping off one shoulder, goggles snapped into place, ready to jump in the way she'd been imagining all week. I watched her go with the easy, unthinking confidence of a kid who has never once considered that she might not be welcome somewhere. And then I watched Beckett turn to his friends, say something too quiet for me to catch over the pool filter and the pop music drifting from someone's phone, and I watched all 3 or 4 of them laugh. That particular sharp, performative laugh kids do when they want the person nearby to know the joke is at least partly about them, even if the exact words don't reach. Ivy paused at the pool's edge, her bounce faltering just slightly, though she recovered fast the way kids do when they're determined not to let a small sting show. She waited a beat, then tried again a few minutes later, walking up to the group with the particular hopeful bounce she does when she wants to be included, shoulders slightly forward, a small, expectant smile already forming, the posture of a kid who has decided the first attempt must have just been a misunderstanding. That's when Beckett said it, loud enough that half the yard turned to look, loud enough that I would replay the exact cadence of it in my head for months afterward, trying to understand how a 9-year-old had learned to deliver a sentence with that particular, practiced contempt. We don't play with poor relatives. The pool went quiet except for the filter humming steadily and someone's phone playing music too softly now to fill the sudden silence that had opened up across the yard. Ivy stood there in her dolphin goggles, dripping slightly at the ankles from where she'd already stepped into the shallow end, not fully understanding the specific weight of the words, but understanding, with the awful clarity kids have even before they have the vocabulary for it, that something in them was aimed at her like a weapon, and that it had landed exactly where it was meant to land. I looked toward Weston and Priscilla, waiting for the correction, the apology, the swift parental intervention I'd have delivered in half a second if Ivy had said something like that to anyone, at any party, in any context. Instead, I watched my brother's face do something I will never forget. He smiled. Priscilla actually nodded, like Beckett had recited a poem correctly, like he'd made them proud. For a long moment, I genuinely couldn't process what I was seeing. Some part of my brain kept insisting there had to be a different explanation, that Weston was smiling at something else entirely, some private joke unrelated to his son's cruelty, that I'd misread the whole exchange in the chaos of pool noise and sunlight glare. But his eyes were on Beckett, unmistakably, and the smile stayed fixed there, small and satisfied, the exact expression I remembered him wearing as a kid when our mother praised him for cleaning his room without being asked. Ivy hadn't moved. She stood at the edge of the shallow end, water dripping off her ankles onto the concrete, her dolphin goggles still pushed up on her forehead, and I watched her face cycle through something complicated. Confusion first, then the beginning of an understanding she was too young to have earned yet, then something that broke my heart more than anything else that day. She looked toward me, searching my face for a cue on how to feel about what had just happened to her. I crossed the yard faster than I remember deciding to move. I don't recall exactly what I said in that first instant, something like her name, sharp, the way you say a child's name when you need them to come to you immediately, but I remember crouching down in front of Ivy, putting both hands on her small, cold, wet shoulders, blocking her view of Beckett and his friends with my own body, because in that moment the only thing that mattered was that she stop looking at them and start looking at me instead. "You're not poor," I told her, quietly, though I could hear the yard around us straining to listen anyway. "And even if we didn't have as much money as some people, that would never, ever make you less than anyone. Do you understand me?" She nodded, though I could see she didn't fully understand. Not yet, not the specific mechanics of what had just happened to her, only that it had hurt and that I was angry on her behalf, which seemed to steady something in her posture even before the words made complete sense. Then I stood up and turned to face my brother. "What was that?" I said. I kept my voice level, though it cost me something to keep it that way, some effort I could feel in my jaw and the backs of my hands. "Weston, what was that?" He had the decency, at least, to stop smiling, though what replaced it wasn't quite an apology either, more a kind of practiced diplomatic neutrality, the face he probably used in business negotiations when he needed to seem reasonable while conceding nothing. "Kids say things," he said. He didn't mean anything by it. He said we don't play with poor relatives, I repeated, And I watched several of the country club mothers on their chaise lounges suddenly find their phones extremely interesting. The particular studied non-involvement of people who don't want to be caught watching but very much are. In front of 30 people. And you smiled at him. I think you're reading into a kid being a kid, Priscilla said, rising from her lounge chair with the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who has never once had to worry about being on the losing side of a confrontation. She walked over, adjusting her sunglasses, her tone pitched exactly at the register adults use when they want to sound reasonable while dismissing you completely. Beckett's very perceptive for his age. Kids pick up on differences, in how families do things. It's not an insult, it's just an observation. It's not an observation when it's said like a weapon, I said. And it's definitely not an observation you smile at. Priscilla's mouth tightened slightly, the first real crack in her composure. I think you're being oversensitive because of, she paused and I watched her decide in real time how much of the actual sentence she wanted to say out loud in front of that many witnesses. Because of your situation, she finished instead, which was somehow worse than whatever she'd been about to say originally, precisely because of how carefully sanitized it was. My situation, I repeated. You know what I mean, she said, waving a hand vaguely, as if the specifics were beneath discussing directly. It's understandable that a comment like that might feel personal to you, given everything. I looked at Weston, waiting for him to step in, to correct his wife the way he should have corrected his son minutes earlier, and instead, he just stood there, arms crossed loosely, his expression somewhere between embarrassed and resigned, a man clearly more invested in not disrupting his wife's afternoon than in defending his sister's daughter from public humiliation at a party his family had hosted. Weston, I said again, quieter this time, because some part of me was still hoping, foolishly, that my actual brother, the boy who'd once given me his last $5 for a school field trip because our mother didn't have it, might reappear from underneath whoever he'd become. Say something. He exhaled, glancing toward Beckett, who was still standing near the diving board with his friends, watching this unfold with the particular flat curiosity kids get when adults argue about something that started with them but has stopped being about them specifically. Beckett, Weston said finally, in a tone so gentle it barely qualified as correction. That wasn't very nice, bud. Apologize to your cousin. Beckett looked at his father, then at his mother, clearly calibrating what was actually expected of him here, and then he looked at Ivy with an expression that held no real remorse in it at all, just the flat compliance of a kid performing an apology he'd been told to perform. Sorry, he said, in the exact bored tone kids use when a word has been extracted from them rather than felt. Ivy, still pressed slightly against my side, didn't say anything back. She just looked down at the water, at her own goggles' reflection rippling on the surface, and I felt something in my chest crack clean through, watching my daughter absorb, in real time, the lesson that an apology extracted under duress from someone who doesn't mean it isn't actually worth very much at all. That's not an apology, I said, to Weston, to Priscilla, to whoever in that yard was still listening. And frankly, neither was what you two just did back there, standing around waiting to see if you had to say anything at all. Priscilla's face went cold in a different way then, the pleasant mask dropping entirely. I think, she said, you should maybe take a breath before you say something you'll regret in front of everyone. I looked around the yard, at the mothers on their lounge chairs, phones abandoned now, openly watching, at Beckett's friends, still clustered by the diving board, whispering to each other, at Weston, arms still crossed, saying nothing further, at my daughter, 7 years old, standing dripping and humiliated in a stranger's expensive backyard because her cousin had learned, somewhere from someone, that our family's worth could be measured and found wanting, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the initial shock of it, exactly what I needed to do next. I bent down and picked up Ivy's towel from where it had slipped entirely off the pool's edge into a damp heap on the concrete. We're leaving, I told her quietly, wrapping it around her shoulders even though she'd barely gotten wet, more for the comfort of being wrapped in something than for warmth. Go get your bag from the chair, sweetheart. But I didn't even get to swim, she said, and the small, Wounded confusion in her voice did more damage to me in that moment than anything Beckett or Priscilla had said, because it meant she still didn't fully understand that what had happened wasn't a swimming problem. It was something much bigger, something I would need to explain to her carefully, later, in a way that didn't let this afternoon calcify into a belief that she was somehow less than the cousins she'd looked up to. "I know," I said. "We'll go swimming somewhere else. I promise." Weston finally seemed to register that I meant it, that I was actually collecting Ivy's things and preparing to walk out of his backyard in front of 30 of his wife's friends, and something like alarm flickered across his face for the first time that afternoon. "Come on, don't be dramatic," he said. "Everyone's going to eat soon." Priscilla ordered catering. "I don't want your catering, Weston," I said, and I heard how tired my own voice sounded, tired in a way that went back years further than that single afternoon. "I want you to have said something when your son humiliated my daughter in front of an entire party. That's what I wanted." The food was never the point. "He's 9, Weston said, lowering his voice, glancing sideways at the gathered guests as if suddenly aware, belatedly, of how this looked. He said something dumb. Kids repeat things they don't fully understand. "Where do you think he heard it?" I asked, and I watched that question land somewhere real, watched something shift behind my brother's eyes, because we both knew exactly where a 9-year-old learns to sort people by their bank accounts and deliver the verdict with that particular practice contempt. Kids don't invent that kind of cruelty from nothing. They learn it from the dinner table, from overheard conversations, from the tone adults use when discussing relatives who didn't marry as well, didn't earn as much, didn't end up on the right side of whatever line the family had quietly drawn. Weston didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer, or he had one and didn't want to say it out loud in front of his wife's friends, which amounted to the same thing. I took Ivy's hand, picked up the fruit salad bowl I'd stayed up cutting the night before, still mostly untouched on the food table, and walked toward the gate without saying anything else, because there wasn't anything else worth saying to people who needed the explanation in the first place. Our mother caught up with us in the driveway. She'd been inside when it happened, helping Priscilla's sister with something in the kitchen, and she'd clearly heard secondhand what had gone on by the time she found us loading Ivy's damp towel into the back seat. "What happened?" she asked, though something in her face told me she already suspected, already knew the general shape of it even without the specifics. I told her, standing there in the driveway with my hand still shaking slightly from adrenaline, and I watched my mother's face go through its own transformation, shock first, then something colder and more focused, an anger I hadn't seen in her in years, not since she'd worked 2 jobs to keep Weston and me fed and had run out of patience, more than once, for anyone who looked down on that effort. "I'm going back in there," she said.
"Mom, don't."
"It's fine. We're leaving." "It is not fine," she said, and there was a steel in her voice I remembered from childhood, the specific tone she used when she meant something with her entire body. "You are my daughter, and that is my granddaughter, and I will not stand by while my son lets his wife's money convince him that we are something to be embarrassed about." She went back through the gate, and though I didn't follow her inside, I found out later, from our aunt who'd witnessed the whole thing, what she said to Weston in front of the remaining guests, that she hadn't raised him in that 2-bedroom apartment, working double shifts at the diner and then the hospital laundry, so that he could grow up and let his son mock the very hands that had fed him as a child. That whatever Priscilla's family had, it hadn't given Weston his character, and if he'd let it erode that character to the point where he could smile while his sister's daughter was humiliated, then he had a much bigger problem than any bank account could fix. Weston didn't say much in response, apparently, according to my aunt. He just stood there, the same way he had in front of me, arms crossed, saying nothing, which told its own story. I drove Ivy to a public pool across town that same afternoon, one with a shallow end and a lifeguard chair and a snack bar selling overpriced popsicles, the kind of ordinary, unglamorous place that had never once made me feel like I was being measured against anyone. Ivy swam for 2 hours, mostly recovered by the second hour, laughing at something a stranger's kid said in the pool, and I sat on the edge with my feet in the water, watching her, feeling the specific ache of a parent who knows a wound has been opened even if the child in front of you looks, for now, like she's forgotten it happened. That night, after her bath, sitting on the edge of her bed while she picked out a book, she asked me, quietly, in the particular unguarded way kids ask their hardest questions right before sleep. Are we poor, Mom? I sat with that question for a moment before answering because I wanted to get it right, wanted to give her something true, and also something sturdy enough to carry with her. We have exactly what we need, I told her. We have a home and food and people who love us, and I work hard at a job that helps people get better after they're hurt. Some families have more money than we do. That's true. But having more money doesn't make anyone a better person, or a more important person, or someone whose feelings matter more than yours. Beckett said something today that was cruel and untrue, and the fact that his parents let him say it doesn't make it true either. It just means they have some things to learn. She was quiet for a moment, processing that in the careful way 7-year-olds process things that matter. I don't want to go to his birthday party anymore, she said finally. You don't have to, I told her. Not unless you want to, and not until his parents understand that what happened today wasn't okay. I didn't hear from Weston for 11 days after that. When he finally called, it wasn't quite the apology I'd hoped for, though it was more than I'd expected given how the afternoon had ended. He said Priscilla had been upset with him for letting things get out of hand, which told me plenty about where the actual accountability in that household tended to land. He said he'd talked to Beckett, that Beckett had been made to understand that what he'd said was unkind. He didn't say cruel. He didn't say anything about where a 9-year-old learns to sort relatives by income and deliver the verdict out loud at a pool party. He asked if Ivy and I would come to Beckett's birthday party the following month, like the intervening weeks had already smoothed everything back into place simply by passing. I'll think about it, I told him, which was true, though what I was actually thinking about wasn't the birthday party at all. I was thinking about the version of my brother I remembered from that shared bedroom with a curtain instead of a door, the boy who'd once given me his last $5 without a second thought, and wondering how much of him was actually still in there, underneath the country club memberships, and the wife who taught him it was better to stay silent than inconvenience the wrong people. I did eventually go to family gatherings again, though I went differently after that afternoon, less anxious about the sundress, less inclined to stay up cutting fruit salad as some quiet offering meant to prove I belonged there. I stopped performing for a family that had made clear, in the most painful way possible, exactly how they'd priced my worth. Ivy went back to some of those gatherings too, cautiously, on her own terms, and I watched her, over the following months, develop a kind of clear-eyed distance from Beckett that broke my heart a little even as it made me proud, not unkind, never cruel back, just quietly unwilling to hand him the same uncomplicated worship she'd offered before, because some part of her, even at 7, understood now that adoration should be earned rather than assumed. Weston and I are still working out what our relationship actually is, all these months later. It isn't what it used to be, and I don't know if it ever fully will be again, not because I can't forgive a 9-year-old for repeating something he'd absorbed from the adults around him, but because I haven't yet seen my brother do the harder work of examining what he let his son absorb in the first place, and why it had taken his own mother, standing in a driveway, to say the thing he should have said himself. In that first silent moment beside the pool, before his son's words had time to land on my daughter like something aimed and true,